As federal parliament turns this week, what are going to be the big issues dominating discussion amongst MPs over the coming weeks and months? I'm grateful to be joined today by Ginny Roth, partner at Crestview Strategy and regular Hub contributor, to answer precisely that question. Ginny, thanks so much for joining me.
Good to be back, as always.
It's been 24 hours since parliamentarians descended on Ottawa. We saw an interesting exchange between Prime Minister Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, yesterday in the House. Why don't you just set the stage for our audience? What did you take away from yesterday, and what might it tell us about this fall parliamentary session?
Yeah, there's a real challenge for the Conservatives, who in many ways get to set the tone of question period. They don't get to set the tone of the whole Parliament, but they do get to set the tone of question period, especially the Conservative opposition because of their position and how much time they can kind of command, and also their
Yes.
experience. Mark Carney is a highly competent individual, but he has zero parliamentary experience, save the week or two he spent there in the summer. And so the world is their oyster in a way, but they have this real challenge of like, what issues do they choose to fixate on? And I remember hearing from a Conservative MP shortly after Poilievre became leader. um, at first they didn't love the discipline around question period because they'd previously been able to ask their pet questions about their ridings and this and that. But Poilievre brought this, housing, budget, crime, like fixation and focus on cost of living that really brought a lot of a sense of order and continuity and message discipline to question period. But that was around a message that was pre-election. It was completely
Yes.
different circumstances, right? The economy was in a different state. There was a different liberal leader, very importantly under Justin Trudeau. And that's not the case anymore. And my sense is that the Conservatives are really going to go into a bit of a trial period where they see what is going to stick. And it seems to me that the best way to go about that, and I think the way they are, is to say, where is the government falling down? And where can we offer contrast? So, where is the government falling down? Well, on Canada, US, and some of those commitments, on fiscal discipline and some of those expectations. But those are areas that are harder for the Conservatives to differentiate. It's hard to say what they would do differently with Trump. It's hard to say what they would do on the budget, frankly,
Yes.
absent really serious austerity, which I don't think there's a huge public appetite for. But immigration, we saw a lot of question period focus on immigration, clear area of contrast for the Conservatives, where you see public opinion aligning against the government not all that interested in following the Conservatives' lead. So a huge opportunity for them. And then add to that a weak minister, which I think we saw in question period. And Minister Diab, she may get her sea legs under her yet, but for now she seems quite weak in that setting. And they have to find, which are a few more areas like that. I think crime is also an obvious one. The Minister of Justice didn't do a very strong job, I don't think, or hasn't so far. And so there's this trial period, right? I think we'll see that throughout this week and in the coming weeks. The Conservatives really testing and trial running issue areas so that as they approach Christmas and into the new year, they can articulate what are these new areas where we're going to tell our caucus this is the only thing we're going on, and we're going to teach the electorate when they think of these issues, they should think of us.
We'll come to immigration because it's a subject we've talked and written about at the Hub in recent weeks. What appears to be a bet on the part of Pierre Poilievre and his team that immigration may be this parliamentary cycle's version of inflation and housing of the past. But before we get there, I want to take up Poilievre's tone. There is a prevailing view, I think, that part of the reason the Conservatives didn't ultimately win the last election is that there were some voters who were apprehensive about the Poilievre and his more combative or confrontational form of politics. In recent interviews and indeed in his opening questions to Prime Minister Carney yesterday, there seemed to be a deliberate effort to smooth off some of those rough edges. Talk a bit about that, Jenny. Do you think that's the right play, and ultimately do you think it can work?
Um, I think generally what I would say about the tone debate is I don't think he should change his tone. Like if I had to simplify it, I think so much of the upside of Poilievre and the one of the ways that you can attribute the success he's had to date, new voters he's brought in, an excited caucus going into the last election, the period where he was polling high, and frankly, a pretty new high watermark for the Conservatives in the
Yes.
last decade or couple, is attributable to his fighter persona.
Hmm.
And I think that brings with it a certain tone. It also, I think, is anchored in quite a bit of authenticity. And his whole persona his whole life has been anchored in quite a bit of authenticity and consistency. And so to meddle with that too much just feels, one, like it wouldn't work. Two, like the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze, the trade-offs of who he might lose or disengage or demotivate. And by the way, I think that's a huge risk. A lot of these new voters that he brought in, they could quite easily, I think maybe even right now they are demotivated because they feel as though their vote was a bit of a waste.
Yes.
He needs to remotivate those people. And so to sort of try to ape some version of, or work back from what some person says they want, and of him being a bit more prime ministerial or whatever, I think risks taking away a lot of what has made him successful so far. However, I do think that there is a way to add dynamism and complexity to his fighter persona that he could lead into. I'll use the example of the fact that he often, a few times publicly in the last year or so, has almost been brought to tears when he's talked about stories about individuals who are struggling. That is a side of his fighter persona that I think brings nuance, seems empathetic,
Yes.
is more well-rounded, in many ways more mature. And I think that is, if there's anything to lean into in terms of change or updates, that is the way that I would emphasize a freshening of the tone, maybe, or picking different battles, showing different sides of what I think is his authentic self. That is what I hope to see from him, and I think what we'll see more of. Certainly, you saw it in his acceptance speech from when he won the by-election. There was a real sense of being a fighter, but there was also a sort of a more emotional, humane, mature side. And I think that is a version of him that people crave and that can really broaden his coalition.
Yeah, well said. Here's hoping some members of his team are listening and watching this conversation. I want to come to the subject of immigration because, as you say, it's a case here where the Conservatives have clearly sought a differentiation vis-a-vis the government. In his first exclusive interview after the election with the Hub, he talked about actually setting immigration at rates that would achieve net population decline in the coming years. And then, of course, in more recent weeks, his commitment to eliminate the temporary foreign worker program. And I understand we may see more policy along these lines. Talk about the opportunities and challenges, Ginny, when it comes to leaning into the immigration issue.
So I think there's some really safe territory for the Conservatives on this file. And for me, it's the most when we're talking about supply meeting demand. So these issues around housing, around healthcare service availability, I think this is a really fruitful place to talk about the immigration issue. It takes the light away from individual immigrants and makes it
Yes.
about the experience of all Canadians, many of them recent immigrants themselves, being able to sort of like live the good life in Canada, as it were. Um, uh, Ultimately, rent and then maybe buy a home, be able to access healthcare, be able to access childcare. It speaks to like the Canadian promise in many ways, and being able to
Yes.
fulfill that Canadian promise for all Canadians, I think is sort of like a very accessible message on immigration. I also think there's something to be said for the very specific nature of the temporary foreign worker program, and where we see the Canadian promise maybe falling down right now, especially for unemployed young people. Youth unemployment is up a bit. And I think you have young people and also their parents, a generation that's watching them saying, here is yet another thing that is in scarce supply for which there's too much demand. So that is all really, really safe ground. Getting into the economics of the specifics of the temporary foreign worker temporary foreign worker program requires a bit more nuance. If particularly when it comes to the regional complexity of when we bring in a lot of immigrants, they go to the GTA. That's just the reality.
Yes.
And if
Yes.
if you ask someone in Regina, they would say, well, actually, we don't have enough people. We would like to see some growth. We would like to see we think our local economy will thrive if more people join it. And I don't think that's really a right or a left thing. I think that's a regional thing. And so accounting for that regional nuance is going to be important. But part of the reason all of that is safe territory for the Conservatives right now is because the Liberals have just not convinced Canadians that they're acting on immigration. they had a moment, I think, in the campaign where they were able to put the immigration issue aside a little bit because they said we're going to ramp down numbers drastically from where Trudeau was. Trudeau had ratcheted them up so high that to bring them down at all just seemed like really meaningful progress.
Yes.
Now, though they're not, they seem not to be living up to their levels commitment, which there's sort of like the policy side and the managerial side. The policy side is maybe there's some improvements. The managerial side seems not to be improving. It got so bad under Trudeau, you may recall that bank economists couldn't even do proper economic projections because they couldn't expect the government to keep
Yes.
managerially keep in line with their policy commitments around levels when it comes to immigration. And that still seems to be an issue. And I worry with a relatively inexperienced minister, although she has some experience, but an experience at the federal level with a big, challenging portfolio, the extent to which they'll be able to keep um, that execution in line. And as long as they can't, and as long as Carney won't acknowledge the problem in the same new way that Poilievre is, it remains very fruitful territory for the Conservatives.
I want to ask one more question about the Conservatives before we turn to the government. Let me just formulate this, and then I'd be interested in your reaction. In addition to parliamentarians coming back to Ottawa yesterday, we saw some protests or some activists in and around Parliament characterizing themselves as "quote unquote" Canada First. I think some were partly motivated by the recent killing, of course, of American conservative Charlie Kirk, but it was wrapped up in a bunch of different issues. Coming out of Parliament, we saw some even conservative MPs uh, a bit apprehensive of engaging some of the participants in those movements. I saw a video today of one of the participants self-defining as anti-Semitic. Just talk a bit about the energy that we saw play out there and the challenge for Poilievre to, on one hand, be responsive to some of those elements of his base without succumbing to its excesses.
Yeah. And the leadership campaign, Pierre Poilievre's leadership campaign was defined in not similar but different circumstances. Similar in the sense that we were in a post-pandemic environment where a lot of Canadians were still very, very angry. And the cohort of people who were angry, who protested in and around the convoy, and subsequently, and ultimately, in many cases, attended Pierre Poilievre's leadership campaign rallies,
Yes.
were varied. They were diverse. They had brought all kinds of different perspectives. I was one of the people who was frustrated by the excesses of the pandemic and policy around the pandemic. And I am not an anti-Semite. I'm very normal and very mainstream. And I think what Poilievre did in that moment was when a lot of people were scared, a lot of conservatives were scared about engaging with any of those people. He said, like, I have the self-confidence in my own positions to engage
Yes.
with people and find common ground and then reject the ones that don't share my common ground. And you know what? If you catch me shaking hands with someone in a photo, I'm okay with that. If I shake someone's hand, that doesn't mean I share all their views, right? And I think at that in that moment, people really crave this like post-cancel culture sort of common sense approach to being able to just engage and not feel constantly afraid of what you might be accused of. And I think conservatives need to remember that today. Um, there may well be there. I didn't actually see the footage from Parliament Hill, but my mother lives near Christie Pitts in Toronto, and there was a similar
Sure.
protest over the weekend.
Yes.
Um, and she went by. She's a very mainstream woman, and she sort of described it as a clash between people who are more culturally conservative, who think immigration numbers are too high, the economy is struggling, they're struggling with cost of living, and they kind of want to take a stand. And a bunch of people who live in her neighborhood who have different views, who like will always be really radically pro-immigration no matter what, and who think about refugees and immigrants as a matter, a sort of human rights issue and whatever. Just people with like reasonable differences of opinion. And of course, there are fringe elements to each side. There were also like Black Bloc Antifa people at this counter protest, just as there, I'm sure, were anti-Semites and maybe truly fascist in some way, people on the other side. Uh, if I can take anything from the Charlie Kirk uh, killing of a number of days ago, it's that the thing to do in those tough environments is to step into them and try to have the conversation. And I don't want to get too philosophical, but like I think that's also when conservatives succeed, is when they step into them, they try to have the conversation and they articulate their principles so that it's incredibly crystal clear that anti-Semites have no place in the Conservative Party and are not part of the conservative coalition, and that none of us have any interest in welcoming them into our coalition. Um, but that doesn't mean that you should avoid the tough issues or tough environments because you might brush up against that. In fact, it means you should engage, articulate what you stand for, and be really confident in that. And I think that
Yeah.
conservatives have to keep that in mind because the risk is that we just disengage um, and that these like really challenging issues of cost of living, of Canadian culture, um, uh, and these sort of like big open questions don't aren't engaged with because politicians across the spectrum run away from them.
Yeah, well said. And as we've learned too many times in the past several years, when those issues go disengaged, that doesn't mean they disappear. They
That's
stay
right.
below the surface and then explode as a result
Well,
of some kind
as
of
you
catalyst.
yeah, as you said, Sean, like there are countries all over the world where political parties, in large part on the far right, although also on the far left, that are capturing the fringe elements of these movements because mainstream parties are not finding ways to talk to people who have these challenges and these issues. I think we've largely avoided that in Canada because Pierre
Yeah,
Poilievre
for
has
sure.
done a pretty good job of talking to those people. So I agree with that.
Well said. Before we wrap up, we just have to talk a bit about the government. We're speaking on September 16th. We have word today that longtime Trudeau Minister Chrystia Freeland is going to step down from her cabinet role. It's possible in the coming days we learn she's also resigning her seat as a member of parliament. There's also been reporting in the Globe and Mail that there is some pressure on longtime MPs, Liberal MPs, to step down so that Mark Carney can bring some of his quote unquote own people into the government. Of course, given the nature of his ascendancy to the Liberal leadership and then the Prime Minister, he's surrounded by a lot of people who aren't quote unquote his people. Talk a bit about that challenge for him and what we might see in the coming weeks as the Prime Minister seeks to surround himself with quote unquote his people.
Yeah, I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, I really admire the extent to which Mark Carney seems to see a lot of the small p politics of governing as a bit of a distraction. And he has this sort of like fearless desire to focus on moving public policy forward. I disagree with a lot of the ways he wants to do that. I think he's doing that with mixed success, but he's not getting so deeply mired in the super political elements of the job from day one. And I think that there's like some upsides to that. The challenge is, and you know this from working in government, you cannot govern as an island. The prime minister's office has a lot of centralized power, and that's fine. But you ultimately have ministerial responsibility. You have to be able to delegate big files to key ministers. You have to have a finance minister you can trust. And you do ultimately have to think about your voting coalition. You have to think about how you get reelected. And by all accounts, even though Mark Carney does not seem to be too political day to day, he wants to secure a majority government. He wants to go to an election at some point in the next couple of years and try to secure that majority. And so if he does want that, he has to always be thinking about his voting coalition and about the people around him who are going to help him speak to that coalition, achieve his goals, etc. And I think it's really challenging when you inherit people that you didn't recruit. Um, he seems to have won over a lot of caucus members and cabinet ministers, at least for now. I think a lot of them are willing to sort of like put their own stuff aside and put their trust in this new guy. Mainly, I think because it got so bad under the old guy, and so many
Yes.
of these MPs thought they were going to lose their jobs and then didn't.
Yes.
And I think they've got to attribute a lot of that to Mark Carney. I'm frankly surprised that he didn't take that credibility he'd earned with them to really shake up cabinet in the first instance. So I think what actually he was doing was he was saying some of these experienced cabinet ministers, let's watch them sort it out for themselves. And if they end up not living up to my expectations, then when I shuffle cabinet and put new people in, it will seem really deserved. It will seem like really
Yes.
people sort of wrote their own histories. And I think that's probably wise. Situation with Minister Freeland's interesting because they've got very close personal relationship, despite Freeland having been a Trudeau minister. But I think that
Yes.
they were not jiving in terms of public policy, in terms of being on the same page in this government. And so I think it's convenient for her to depart. There will be some other departures that are, I can't imagine Minister Guilbeault is long for the government. And so if they can find a convenient way to put that aside, that'll be good for Minister Carney. But he will still be confronted with, in many cases, MPs who do not have cabinet experience and who probably do not live up to the managerial expectations of someone who, by all accounts, is a very tough manager. Um, and that is going to be very challenging for him, especially as he gets closer to a period where he's going to want to go into an election and he has to get political. And he's going to have cabinet ministers saying, if I do this, it's going to upset this diaspora group, or if I do this, it's going to upset this labor union, or if I do this, it's going to, and he does not like to hear that because he doesn't like politics. But that is the cold hard reality of getting reelected. And it's a reality he didn't really had to confront all that much in the last general election because of the unique circumstances of how he won the leadership campaign, the Canada-US and Donald Trump dynamic that drove the entirety of the campaign narrative. And so he's kind of put off the inevitable. And I worry for him about how he'll fare when he has to uh, get his hands wet.
Yeah, well, let's wrap up there because I want to ask a question about the Carney coalition as we head into the fall session. What's interesting as an outsider is on certain issues he's leaned to the right, on other issues he's leaned to the left. It seems to me the budget may be a defining moment where the prime minister has more limited options when it comes to these different lanes. Talk a bit about the potential risk for Carney on his left flank.
They're honestly hard to size. Like, I think you and I would both say he's got a huge risk on his left flank because he's occupying this moderate center territory in the rare cases where he has made tough calls, like in bringing in binding arbitration and ultimately putting the flight attendants in a tough spot. He that it would seem to be that he's really alienating a huge part of the left of center coalition. All those voters who opted not to vote NDP and voted Liberal instead because they thought this is worth it to stop the Conservatives and this guy's going to have to govern for this broad left of center coalition. Those people are constantly disappointed when he takes a step, whether it's on labor union matters, on environmental matters. I mean, there's some talk about him potentially dropping the emissions cap after already having moved on consumer carbon tax, moving to a certain extent on EVs. Um, People like Karina Gould, who is the chair of his finance committee, government finance of the parliamentary finance committee, rather. People like Nader Erskine Smith, even people like Catherine McKenna, who are sort of like left of center leaders outside of government. In many ways, I actually think that because the NDP is so weak right now, um, people within the Liberal caucus and within liberal circles, let's say, um, those are actually going to be the most challenging to manage. They feel like they can speak up when he pushes too far, and I think you're going to see long like lines at the mic in caucus in the coming months if he continues to sort of betray some of the more strong progressive fixtures of the previous government. Not because it's a betrayal of Trudeau's legacy or whatever, but because a lot of these young liberals, I mean, Karina Gold is a great example. She would be a peer of ours. Who was brought into liberal politics in many ways because of Justin Trudeau, because of a
Yes.
certain type of progressive liberalism that is like pretty ideological and not
Yes.
always super pragmatic and technocratic. And so I think that actually the NDP is very unlikely to suddenly elect a really charismatic leader, find this great path on the sort of like materialist left and chart some news or on Mamdani course. That seems very unlikely to me. But there are civil institutions like public sector labor unions that have big war chests and a lot of resources. There are environmental NGOs. And more than that, there are liberals who will not allow Mark Carney to push them too far out of their comfort zone without a bit of discomfort. He has some ability to push against that because of the lack of electoral challenge on the left. But I think he has to be careful how much rope he uses.
Great insight as always. We'll have to have you back on as this parliamentary session unfolds to test some of that analysis, but I think it's spot on as usual. Ginny Roth, partner at Crestview Strategy, thank you so much for joining us in this episode of Hub Hits.
Thanks, Sean.
This video has been brought to you by Airbnb. Thank you, Airbnb, for sponsoring the Hub's YouTube channel this month. Governments, as Hub listeners and viewers know, are rightly focused on addressing Canada's housing crisis. But when they spend their time regulating short-term rentals like Airbnb, they're not focused on what matters most. According to Statistics Canada, the number of short-term rentals that could be potentially converted into long-term homes is just 0.6%. Yet Canada needs almost 6 million new homes by 2030 to achieve affordability. A closer look tells us that clearly building more homes, not regulating or restricting short-term rentals, is the only real solution. Learn more at airbnb.ca/closer look.